and celebrations, much as this is, I suppose, something that could go down in the, well, you could call it historical. I've heard some of the commentators describe it as the most historical thing to happen since the Trojan horse, as far as stealth warfare and espionage and the security services and props have been given left, right, and center to the Israeli Mossad or whichever other department was in charge of this particular undertaking. I did mention that maybe I looked at it from a less or more pessimistic point of view, and I was thinking, if this this method of carrying the battle to the enemy has surfaced now, and we've moved into the digital cyber realm, where we're all owners of devices. Much as it might have been a great day for one side in terms of the global population, excuse me, it might not be such a day for celebration, because my belief is if one person can figure these things out, I'm sure other parties can, given time. And I heard somebody say today, I think it was a representative from the UN, that as far as global legality, there's something where they do advise that you are not to weaponize domestic items or something like that. But, on the other hand, others would say all is fair in love and war, and in times of conflict, the rules are forever being revised and rewritten. Thing is, I will go along with saying that a page has probably been turned with using such a sophisticated and fairly brutal method to carry the battle to the opposition, the opponent, as far as the outer war is concerned. It does open up doors that you don't know what's going to be carried through. And there's another thing as well. If you want to be kind of balanced and fair-minded and sort of stand in the middle on this, the same actions, if they were carried out, I mentioned this yesterday, I think, as well, by a democratic state, and carried out, even carried out on combatants, some of which may be non-active, as in, soldiers on leave, or combatants, not in the battlefield, doing their shopping, like in the grocery store, where one of those devices went off. Does that mean it's fair game for anyone across the board now? I mean, one side's going to say, well, you know what? That's doable. And I think it doesn't look good expanding the means of warfare in this digital type of way, but you can't stop the wheels of change. Anyway, what really got me looking back on this subject is I came across Sheila Fogarty on LBC, and the discussion she had pretty much landed right in the middle of how I had started to think about this thing. Let me see if I can pull it up.
To go back to their homes in the north, or their home areas.
Give me a second here. Technology.
Back to their homes in the north, or their home areas, because Lord knows many of their homes won't be standing. That I mean, I may be misreading it. It's easy to misread elements of this story, obviously. That seems to me to be, or could be, an indication of a cooling down by Israel in Gaza, that is. Again, I might be wrong. Events on the ground might prove.
So the idea is we're looking at one side saying that they, I think the word is being proactive, taking the battle, to their opposition in order to de-escalate things and calm things down. And then you've got Blinken on the other hand, traveling around the globe, saying he's doing his bestest to reach some kind of solution and de-escalate this conflict from spreading out and widening around the Middle East. So bearing in mind he is representing the most powerful country, well, as far as we know, on the globe, who are backing any kind of expansion if it does take place. I think we're in a strange time where the definition of self-defense is really taken on a broad sense of the word. In any case, further ado, yes, press on.
To be wrong, but if it is the case, that gives me a little bit more hope that this latest ceasefire that
I think the phrase is
the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was alluding to in his comments in Egypt is one that might well come about. If that happens, I think we do see a temperature in the Middle East come down. Lord knows it's still a mess and there's still a great deal of human suffering involved.
Look, I'm not an expert when it comes to the art of war, but just using a small amount of common sense, if you're gonna destroy your opponent and, cause great harm to them, humiliation and all the other things thrown into the mix, they're gonna, as human nature does, react in a sort of manner where, let's just say, in a non-peaceful manner. Anyway, without further ado, once again, yes, press ahead.
All over the place. But in terms of that wider regional war that would bring in other global powers as well, America, Iran, Britain, France, Jordan, if that happens, the temperature comes down, then briefly, I suppose, there's a sigh of relief, isn't there? But if it does...
I'm really trying to understand this. So the war, or the potential of a wider war, even though it's not being called out at the moment, is sort of the bear's been poked, and as a result, it de-escalates things in the region. Interesting.
Doesn't happen. If the temperature doesn't come down, and the response by Hezbollah to this pager attack, this extraordinary coup of, military coup really of an attack by Israel, if Hezbollah responds to that under Iran's auspices, then we're in big trouble, I think. And that would inevitably involve British forces if attacks on Israel were to become increasingly great. Britain would be involved. What needs to happen to stop that? To stop that escalation? And if it does come, that wider regional war, right from the off, since October the 7th, this is...
The thing is, if Israel ratchets things up and then it ends up being a full-blown war with Lebanon, Hezbollah, why does that determine Britain immediately getting involved with the melee? I'm sure I'll figure it out.
The conversation has been about avoiding a wider regional war. If it does come, should Britain stand ready and prepared to defend Israel. Is that what you think Britain should do in this instance?
I get it. It's optional.
Is that what you think Britain must do in this instance? 0345 606 0973. Elliot has called from Wallington. Hi, Elliot.
Hi, yeah. How you doing?
Fine, thanks, yeah.
Cool. I think Israel...
Now, this guy's definitely not standing in the middle of the argument, although he does raise some reasonable points.
Fairly kind of set on, well, they seem to be set on trying to drag the West into a wider conflict, with Iran being the ultimate sort of end game, I think. But I think, Israel now kind of acts with impunity, as we've seen in Gaza, with the genocide taking place there. And I think, what...
According to you, Elliot.
According to quite a few people. But
I'm just qualifying it.
I mean, that's fair journalism, stepping in and qualifying things where needed.
It's my job
to
do so.
But sure. But I mean, ultimately, it's been an absolute slaughter in Gaza. But that aside, I think what happened in Lebanon is effectively state-sanctioned terrorism.
I mean, otherwise, the argument sways too far over one side in comparison to the other. So it is a call-in show. So there may be a variety of perspectives brought to the table.
If that had happened in Israel, for example, if that many people had died through Hezbollah, exploding devices with Israeli officials, it would be condemned as a terrorist act, and rightly so, by Western.
I mean, I thought something along those lines yesterday when I was looking into this.
Yet there is absolute silence when it comes to this happening in Lebanon, and I just think the hypocrisy there is quite extraordinary.
I've been reading about some of the injuries. An eye surgeon describing what he had to do. He said he's had to remove more eyes yesterday surgically than he did in his whole 25-year career previously. He said it's been very hard. Most of the patients were young men in their 20s. And it's worth remembering these...
I mean, I get people are celebrating the ingenuity and the sci-fi James Bond type aspect to the whole thing. At the end of the day, people were maimed for life. Some lost their lives. Some civilians lost their lives. Some minors lost their lives. So it was a pretty unpleasant side to the whole thing, however smart and sophisticated it may appear to be.
Men are members of Hezbollah if they've got one of these pages, in all likelihood. Young men in their 20s, and in some cases I've had to remove both eyes. He said he left the operating room at 4 in the morning and returned 3 hours later. Said a new batch of patients was waiting to be operated on every few hours. So it's been it's an incredibly violent and successful attack, isn't it, from Israel's perspective?
But it's killed children. I mean, it's not a case.
And I'm also stuck on this thing that, yeah, I get it. War is war. The thing is, though, if you're not actively on duty, does that mean now, 2024, going forward, any kind of faction on the globe is fair game? Even when you're out of uniform, I thought those were like the globally acknowledged and agreed, rules and stuff, that this stuff took place in designated areas within reason, because we know there's a lot of overlap.
These are targeted. These are explosive devices left on people who may be wandering around anywhere. So that they've exploded them with the full knowledge that it's going to kill other people or certainly injure other people. And if that took place in let's say in the UK, there would be outrage. It would be condemned as a terrorist act. And I think ultimately what's happened here is state-sanctioned terrorism by Israel.
Elliot, not necessarily, because, as in, it wouldn't necessarily be condemned in that way. In this instance, it has been, from the Israeli perspective, and I suspect from the British perspective in terms of its policy position, those pages are used by an organisation deemed to be a terrorist organisation. I'm talking about the Western judgment here, deemed to be a terrorist organisation that has constantly been attacking Israel as well. and uses those pages to communicate not just missile attacks on Israel, but terrorist attacks inside Israel as well. That's what Israel would argue about those pages.
So does that mean then all Israeli officials are kind of legitimate targets, irrespective of where they are in the country?
Nah, this was my concern. This is the worrying aspect of this type of development. And if it's now going to be the way forward, as far as global warfare is concerned, we'll be looking at a completely different landscape to what we've grown accustomed to.
As I say, if mobile phones or whatever were...
But Israel isn't a terrorist group.
Okay, bear with me momentarily. We'll be back on track. Okay, here we go.
Or whatever was worse.
But Israel isn't a terrorist group.
Well, I mean, the way that Israel
you can judge their activities, but they're not a terrorist
absolutely.
group. You know.
Okay, but then Hezbollah,
formally.
you know, and I'm not supporting Hezbollah in the same way that I don't support Hamas.
Though if you stand in the middle of this argument, there are those who will view it one way and others who will view it another. So there's room for debate here.
But I do think that, you know, that they are, you know, officials in sort of a government capacity, whether or not we condemn them or not. I think ultimately what has happened here is state-sanctioned terrorism. Explosions have taken place, you know, knowing full well that there'll be civilian casualties in a country that they're not actually at war with at the moment. Yes, missiles are being fired backwards and forwards, but you know, if that
they are
happened,
at war. They are.
Well, I mean, if that happened in any other circumstance, you know, if that happened in America, there would be absolute outrage, and rightly so. And I think, you know, the silence from countries condemning Israel's actions.
But do you not
is
think? Well, hang on, Elliot. Do you not think that if a group was not a government, but if a terrorist group was attacking Britain, neighbouring us, and repeatedly, both through terrorist acts and with missiles, if the British government, using its military prowess, it carried out that attack against that terrorist group, the pager attack, wouldn't we regard that as I mean, it's grim. All war is grim. All of this stuff is grim. That kind of goes without saying. But wouldn't we regard it as a successful operation to weaken our enemy?
No. I mean, it's a deliberate escalation in an attempt to create a wider conflict, with Iran being the end target.
I mean, I guess any opposing side would see a win as a win. Although, as they widen the boundaries, then you end up in a position where no one's got any gloves on anymore, and everything starts to go.
Dragging
Why
the
is
West
it a deliberate
into that.
escalation?
Wrong as well.
Because Israel, you know, as the gentleman said earlier on, this is like a finger up to the West. This is saying we're not in, you know, we are going to act with impunity, and we are going to drag you into this, whether or not you like it or not. And you know, we saw that previously with Iran.
It's a brutal way of putting it.
On targeting of the embassy, and you know, ramping tensions up between Israel and Iran, and ultimately that's what it's about. Netanyahu is an extremist, and he's more concerned about his personal political career than anything else. And I think what he's trying to do is you know, appeal to the other extremists in the Knesset. And
I mean, I've heard this argument being brought up pretty much every day. Although one thing I've noticed, it doesn't seem to affect any type of change.
You know, ramp things up so that it does turn into a wider conflict, and they can try and defeat Iran and take out that what they see as a threat.
But how would you describe the bombings into Israel by Hezbollah, a terrorist group, for months and months and months? Is that extremism too?
I think the firing of missiles back and forth between the two nations, you know, effectively, what needs to happen is that people need to sit around the table and try and sort this out. And ultimately, what's happening at the moment is Israel is escalating this through.
I mean, he's got a point on that frontier that there's no way of any of these things, whether you go back 100 years, a couple thousand years, or maybe even look into the future, without some resolution whereby people have to figure out a way of navigating amongst and around one another. Until then, it's war and peace being the interludes between war. Sounds a bit pessimistic, but that has got a slightly familiar, truthful ring to it.
Through the actions in Gaza, through a whole range of stuff, and this.
But
this,
why? Hang on. Why is Israel the only escalator here? There was a certain amount of escalation on October the 7th, wasn't there? And there's been subsequent escalation. I'm not rejecting everything you've said in our conversation, Elliot, by any means, but you do speak as though it's the only group escalating things.
I mean, the horrors that took place on October 7th were rightfully condemned across the world. And what's happened?
Well, they were celebrated in some parts of the world.
Well, but every day since, horrors have been unleashed on innocent people in Gaza.
I know, and some of them Israeli hostages. Yeah.
And ultimately, if you look at what Israel are doing, what they've tried to achieve by military means, they've released 7 hostages, whereas in last November, when they sat down and talked, over 100 hostages were released. So ultimately, this is not about trying to. I don't think Netanyahu really cares about the hostages. If he did, he'd have sat down and talked and got the hostages released.
As would Hamas if they did.
Yes,
it's time to start your business. Time to get customers.
Some reasonable points.
Time to make your future now.
So,
he really cares about the hostages.
If he did,
he'd have sat down and talked and got the hostages released.
As would Hamas if they did.
After the deadly coordinated detonation of thousands of Hezbollah pagers in Lebanon, which killed 12, including 2 young children, and injured nearly 3,000 yesterday, this afternoon there are reports of more explosions in southern Lebanon. The AFP news agency saying the explosions have been caused by walkie talkies spontaneously blowing up. Lebanese state officials report 9 people have so far been killed.
I don't think
this
we've
afternoon.
heard the last of
the
this.
assault on Hezbollah.
I think this is now going to expand and grow into something else. I hope de-escalation is the direction of traffic. Although 2 days in to this new phase, and couldn't tell you where it's going to end up. But we know that where it's leading to at the moment isn't looking good. And my apologies for having to end on such a pessimistic note. I just wanted to touch on how this subject has developed and story. For now, we out. So once again, be good if you can. Be safe. I hope you can. And be creative. CornerSpeak.